Merry Christmas, everyone. Just want to share some thoughts that I've observed regarding Christmas. So, the Christmas time is a season of festivities over many places in the world, from decorations to dinners, church programs, and just gift giving in general. There are just an unlimited amount of options. This involves a tremendous amount of planning to make sure that everything is perfect. And here in the United States, we usually take that to the highest level of preparation, just doing things way over top. But nothing compares to what God does when he does things properly. So in Matthew chapter 2, we see the Christmas story here. I want to read that for you. So if you're turning in your Bible, just go to Matthew chapter 2. We'll be beginning in verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star at its rising and have come to worship him. And when King Herod heard it, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And after calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired from them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus is written by the prophet, And you, Bethlehem, land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For among you will go out a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod secretly summoned the wise men and determined precisely from them the time when the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go, inquire carefully concerning the child, and when you have found him, report to me also, that I may come and worship him. Excuse me, I must drink a little bit here. After they listened to the king, they went out, and behold, the star which they had seen at its rising led them until they came and stood above the place where the child was. Now when they saw the star, they rejoiced with great joy. And when they came into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother. And they fell down and worshipped him. And opening their treasure boxes, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And after being warned in a dream and not to return to Herod, they went back into their own country by another route. So there's two observations that I see when I read this passage. And I'll get to those just a little bit. I want to insert something real quickly. So in the parable of the wise and foolish virgins we see in Matthew 25, Jesus clearly speaks about those who are wise and those who are not. And ironically, the Magi were called wise men by some medieval writers and commentators, but the term wise is not just coincidental. So Matthew 25, this is just a quick insert. Verses 1 and 2, Then the kingdom of heaven may be compared to 10 virgins who took their lamps out and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now 5 of them were wise and 5 of them were foolish. Now quickly going back, let's go back to Matthew chapter 2. This clearly states that these men were well educated and motivated by something amazing. They had seen the star in the east, a miraculous sign in the sky. These men had been watching the skies. But why were they able not only to ascertain that this star was important, but also to connect the dots and see that it represented the birth of the King of the Jews? This question will be answered later. Now, the Christmas story is not original to the Gospels, but it was something predicted since the Garden of Eden and in Genesis chapter 3. In verse 15, the Lord says to the following to Adam and Eve and the serpent after they had disobeyed him. Specifically, Adam and Eve had disobeyed the Lord. It says, I will put hostility between you and between the woman, and between your offspring and between her offspring, and he will strike you on the head, and you will strike him on the heel. Here God is talking with the serpent and Eve. He declares that there will be war and hostility between the offsprings of the serpent and the offsprings of Eve. So even though Adam and Eve committed the world's largest transgression that affected all humanity for all generations, The Lord was not paralyzed by this and provided the clear answer to humanity's needs, the promised offspring, a child, the Messiah. Since that time, there have been an ongoing war waged against the bloodline of that Messiah to stop it from being fulfilled. Abraham doubted the promise that God had given him regarding a child, that it was going to be promised through his wife Sarah. Instead, went and listened to his wife Sarah and had relations with Hagar, ignoring that promise, and a son was given birth to him, which became Ishmael, and a problem even until this day. Pharaoh was used to try to wipe out the Israelites in Egypt, but God provided the Exodus. Israel abandoned God and served idols many, many, many times, but God kept a remnant and remembered his promise to Abraham. The Assyrians and the Babylonians forcibly removed the Israelites from their homeland because they abandoned Yahweh. But God remembered his promise at the garden and to Abraham. God's love and faithfulness thrived. And this takes us to the book of Daniel. Here the breadcrumbs stand out really boldly. Here God raised up a young man named Daniel. Now Daniel was a young man. He was forcibly removed from his home when the Babylonians had invaded Judea, and specifically Jerusalem, and taken him from his parents and carried him away with many other people to the city in the kingdom of Babylon. Now, he easily could have blamed God for his situation and said, you know what, I'm not going to serve God because God did not protect me. And many of his fellow countrymen did that, but he did not. He did not only abandon his faith, but he stood up against a tyrant and challenged him. Because of this young man's determination to remain faithful even when his life was on the line, God elevated him to positions of authority. Now, one of those positions was becoming chief of the wise counselors, the magicians or the magi. That's where we today we get the word magi. There's a connection to magicians because they were able to use magic and other ways through their wisdom to conjure up wisdom for the king. So this position was for all of Babylon and even into Persia when Persia conquered Babylon. Now here's where the dots connect in Matthew chapter 2. God spoke to Daniel in powerful prophetic dreams and visions about future events. These dreams include the coming of a great king and the great Son of Man, which we know is a term used for the Messiah, a great king that will rule that kingdom. And we see this in Daniel chapter 7. This falls in line with the predicted messianic prophecies stated in Genesis 3 and continue through the Old Testament prophets. These visions are recorded in Daniel chapter 2, 4, 7 through 12. And here's the cool part. I think it's a cool part. As head of the wise men, the Magi, Daniel would have been in a position to influence the other magician, the other people who came in to want to become future magicians or future wise men. And they would have known Daniel. They would have known the reputation of Daniel. They would have seen his testimony. Daniel would have been really well known. I mean, he stood up against King Nebuchadnezzar, and he stood up against Darius and was thrown into the lion's den. And they saw how God preserved him. And so he was a man of honor, a man of respect, most likely. The spirit of the gods was upon him. That's what Nebuchadnezzar would say. So how could his faith not be noticed and admired? And if he led some of these men to follow Yahweh, then he would have been able to raise up those who would read his prophetic dreams and the accounts that Daniel had seen, and they themselves would begin to watch for the signs themselves. So Daniel saw things, and so he was able to communicate to those who were with him and those who would follow him, even later generations. These are the signs. In Daniel's dreams, God showed him of kingdoms rising and falling. These are markers. And then there's also the timeline of the 70 weeks. And these gave accurate clues to the coming of the great event, of the great sign that was coming, the coming of the Son of Man. These men not only had to wait and watch, they only had to wait and watch. And years became decades, decades became centuries. But on cue, according to the timeline of the 70 weeks, the sign appeared, the star and the baby. Now these men were not only these men were also expert astronomers and knew the predictable patterns in the sky, but they saw something new and they recognized it as something wonderful, and these men were prepared for it because they had been studying for it, they've been waiting for it. In contrast, we can see when the Magi arrived in Jerusalem, it created quite a panic. Their visit appears to have caught the king and the religious leaders off guard. In fact, Herod had to ask the scribes to give the location of the birth of the Messiah. And it's interesting, if you look at the text, King Herod asked to where the Christ, the Messiah, was going to be born. But the kings, when they showed up, they said, we're looking for the King of the Jews. So somehow in their mind, they connected the dots and said the Messiah will be the King of the Jews. What is obviously apparent is that the celestial event that was taking place, this movement of stars in the sky, had completely been ignored, or at least not considered important enough to be considered. Because Herod asked the Magi, at what time did the star appear? So they weren't paying attention. They were not prepared. And I believe what might have been going on that caught them, why they were unprepared for this, is these group of men had just missed a sign, and they were too consumed by the politics of their day. A little bit of history here. 40 years prior to this specific event, the Parthian Empire had ruled Palestine and Syria. Parthia was once part of the Persian Empire. They had separated, and the Persian Empire became part of the Greek Empire, and the Parthians separated and became their own empire. And they actually became one of the Roman Empire's greatest enemies, that they fought for hundreds and hundreds of years. So prior to this, 40 years ago, the Parthian Empire ruled Palestine and Syria, and only through the victory of Mark Antony and the Roman legions, Palestine came under the rule of Rome. In support of Rome and the new overlords, Herod betrayed the existing leaders, the Hasmoneans, and was appointed king of the Jews by the Romans. So during this 40-year rule, Herod the Great, as he became eventually known, was constantly worried about his fragile hold on the kingdom of Israel or Judea, and he was worried that someone was going to take it from him. He was just always concerned about that. So during Herod's rule, there arose many so-called messianic figures claiming that they were appointed to remove the rule of Rome and restore the kingdom of David. And as quickly as they came to power, they were just as quickly put down and killed. Their focus, these Messiah figures, were focused on Rome. They wanted to restore the kingdom of David as it was 1,000 years prior to that. So when the Magi arrived from the east, most likely, in my opinion, from Parthia, Herod was very unsettled. He saw the claim to his throne being challenged, and when they asked to find the king of the Jews, wait, wasn't Herod the king of the Jews? Yeah, so they asked him to find the king of the Jews. I'm sure Herod was like, what? And also, here's another thing. So if Parthia was asking for a new king, they were threatening Rome's rule over Palestine. And were they preparing to take Palestine back for themselves? So there's a lot of things that he's considering. If someone's challenging his rule as king, someone's potentially threatening Rome, and is Parthia threatening war? And of course, this was totally unexpected and unnerving to Herod. And most people would probably feel like they were in the same situation unless they were prepared. So between the internal revolts of Herod's own rule, the Magi asked about a new king and the possibility of a Parthian invasion. It was easy to see why Herod was a little disturbed. So in the parable of the wise virgins, we see the wise virgins were seeking after the return of the groom and had prepared themselves with enough oil for his return, whereas the foolish ones became preoccupied by the cares of this world and became too busy to realize that they were not prepared. Subsequently, when the groom arrived and announced his arrival, they were forced to find oil in their search missed being part of the wedding and left out. Now in Matthew's Magi narrative, the Magi were prepared and had been preparing for some time, in my opinion. But the ones who ought to have been prepared, the very keepers of the promises of God, missed what God had been prophesying for many years, many, many years. So how can we apply this to each of us? Like Herod in his situation, life is complicated. Life is messy. Life is full of turbulence. We're constantly bombarded with questions, problems. Life just gets messy, and we can easily miss God and his salvation. You look at the story of the Samaritan woman, married 5 times. That means she was divorced at least 4 times, maybe 5 times. Her 5th marriage, if it was still going on, was not good, because she was living with a man who wasn't her husband. Here she is gathering water in the middle of the day, a task that was usually accomplished in the morning because it was cooler. She was probably a woman of scandal, being married 5 times and divorced 5 times. Probably had few friends and was probably very lonely. So while gathering water, she met Jesus, and he started asking her questions. Initially, she deflected Jesus and his questions and focused more on some of the spiritual differences, the ones that usually created hostility between the Jews and Samaritans. But then she realized something. Jesus really did know her. He knew her life. It's easy to miss Jesus in our lives. Life will never get easier, but learning to be prepared for him ensures we don't miss him. We do this by taking time with him daily. Psalm 46:10 says to be still and just know that he is God. Just in the stillness of waiting, listening for his voice, listening for the calmness and knowing that he is God. We see it in the story of Elijah, where Elijah went to the mountain and there was a storm and an earthquake, and God was not there. But God was in the stillness, the still whisper. Psalm 37, verses 3 to 9. This is an area that I've been kind of hovering for the last several weeks. It says to trust in the Lord, to delight yourself in the Lord, to commit your ways to him, to rest in him, to wait on him, to wait on the Lord. It is in this posture of waiting and humbling ourselves, even when life is chaotic, we find that we can receive the greatest gift of all, knowing his heart and being ready. The Magi and the 5 wise virgins were ready and received their reward, whereas the King Herod and the religious leader in Jerusalem and the 5 foolish virgins were not prepared and missed out entirely. So my final words to you is be prepared, be ready, and to do that by waiting on the Lord. And he will speak to you, and he will show you amazing things. It says in Jeremiah 33:3, it says, seek me, and I will show you great and mighty things that you do not know. God bless you guys.